Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Oops, let me go back to the beginning. Yeah, there we go. When I last visited you in Norway House, we lived in a more innocent pre-pandemic world. I certainly can't add anything to what we've all been saying about world events lately, except that we have been given in recent weeks yet another reason to feel grateful for what we do have. Peace and prosperity are more ephemeral than we would like to think. So way back in 2017, it seems like a long time ago now, I spoke to you all about the importance of the Vikings to Ireland and the rest of the Irish Sea world. And the main point of my talk at that time was to bust the myth that the Vikings helped the Irish to unite against a foreign enemy. And one reason for that was that the Vikings themselves were by no means united, and they frequently allied with various Irish groups for their own economic gain. So I argued instead that by helping certain Irish rulers defeat their own Irish rivals, the Vikings actually accelerated a trend that saw a few powerful families gain hegemony over the whole of Ireland. And along the way, the Vikings helped to create the urban landscape of Ireland and transform the Irish culture and economy in important ways. So the story of the Vikings in Ireland is at least as much a story of creation and cooperation as it is a story of destruction. But today, I want to zero in on the most important city that they founded, the current capital of Ireland, Dublin. I imagine that many of you have visited Dublin. This is what the city looks like now. And this is where the medieval Viking settlement was located, on the south bank of the River Liffey. This is still a very important part of the city. So the Viking settlement really did form the kernel of the Dublin that we know today. Though of course the city has expanded greatly, particularly by colonizing the north bank of the Liffey. So we're going to be looking at how this Viking city developed. But we'll also be looking at the role that Dublin played in relations with the rest of the Irish Sea world, including Britain and its associated islands, as well as the Scandinavian homelands of the Vikings and the wider world of Viking exploration and trade. Because Dublin was a vital linchpin in a very extensive network that connected Ireland not just to Europe, but to the Islamic world as well. So how are we going to do this? We're going to cover 6 topics, and I promise I'm going to be very brief, briefer than usual, because I have found that the attention span on Zoom is about 75% at best of what it is in person. First, I'm going to do a very quick recap of the Vikings in Ireland. Then I'm going to look at how Dublin was founded initially in the 9th century. Then there was a brief hiatus during which the native Irish drove the Viking leaders out of Dublin, but then they quickly refounded the city, bigger and better than ever, and expanded their reach around the Irish Sea region. We are then going to take a little bit of a look at daily life in Viking Dublin, and here is one of the places where we will see some cool pictures of archaeological excavations. Next, we will re-examine the famous Battle of Clontarf, which I will be presenting to you in a new light since my last talk about Ireland, because new research has put the Viking involvement in the battle more at the center of our understanding. So new stuff is going to be coming. And finally, we will conclude by looking very briefly at the aftermath of the battle and the long process by which Viking Dublin was assimilated into the larger fabric of Irish life. And just a hint, it was another invasion that finally completed that process. So let's plunge in. Our first task is a very quick reminder of how the Vikings got to Ireland in the first place. And I will preface this by a word about the question historians are always fascinated by. how do we know anything about the Vikings? What kinds of evidence do we have? There are three main kinds. Actually, I'm going to add a fourth. I'll call an audible and add a fourth. They're useful for different things and for checking up on each other, because sometimes if you have evidence from one kind of material, it can help confirm evidence from another kind of material. Because if they weren't talking to each other, then maybe they weren't sort of getting their story straight. They were actually giving you independent witness. But also, these sources all have their problems. So let's start with annals. Annals are records of major events that are kept in this period by religious communities. Sometimes they're compiled over many centuries. And they really are the only contemporary records that we have for the Vikings, in that they were written down at the time of the events themselves, not years later in retrospect. But the fact that they're written down at the time doesn't mean that we need to believe everything that's in them, because they can distort reality. Scholars have discovered that at different times over the centuries, analysts sometimes zeroed in more on Vikings than at other times. And that means that we don't necessarily have like the full picture of every time Vikings were around. Often these sources tend to maximize Viking violence and minimize violence that was perpetrated by local Irish people. The famous case of this is, how many times do monasteries get attacked? So if a Viking attacks a monastery, they're going to write that down. If an Irish person attacks a monastery, it's going to be like, yeah, well, that always happens. And it's not that noteworthy. And so we get a distorted picture of how much of the violence in the Irish landscape is actually being perpetrated by Vikings versus local thugs. So analysts tend to give the Vikings, most historians think, a slightly worse press than they might otherwise deserve. Our next kind of written sources are narratives written much later. The first of these is a text called The War of the Irish Against the Foreigners. And that's the Irish title on the slide. Instantly forget it, it's very difficult to say. And it was written in the early 12th century, several hundred years after the events it describes, which should immediately make us slightly nervous. And it had a pronounced bias in favor of a particular Irish dynasty, the O'Briens, about whom we will talk much later. The other text is actually in Old Norse.
Yeah.
This is Njál's Saga, which, if you have not read Njál's Saga, this is the next thing you have to read. This is an absolute barn burner. Oh, what's it? Barn burner? Ooh, that is literally something that happens in the text. There is a burning of a house. It's kind of central to the story. So anyway, Njál's Saga has a brief section about the famous Battle of Clontarf, which I will talk about later, that took place in 1014. And this is the Viking side. So this is the Viking point of view of the battle. It's part of this 13th century Icelandic saga. Most of it takes place in Iceland. The Irish material is a digression from the main plot. So in this text, we have to slightly worry about the distance and time from the events hundreds of years later, and the fact that it's not actually taking place near the events of the Battle of Clontarf. So I'll have much more to say about the battle later, as I said. So far, I've been pretty tough on the written sources, and they do have another limitation, which is that there aren't any more of them than we know of right now. This is all the texts we're probably ever going to have that relate to Viking Dublin. Maybe we'll discover something else in the future, but this is probably basically it. But one area where we are still finding new information is underground or even underwater. Archaeology has revolutionized our picture of the Vikings in Ireland in general, and in Dublin in particular. One of the coolest kinds of evidence in all of archaeology is the hoard. A hoard is a group of objects, which can include coins, but as you can see on the slide, lots of other trinkets and doodads, basically all things made of metal. And these get buried intentionally, usually for safekeeping. And the reason that we find them is because the people who buried them didn't manage to go back and get them. So something happened to them before they could go back and retrieve the hoard. So the valuables are safe. The people who put them under the ground, probably not so safe. Hoards often tell us a great deal about the circulation of coinage and other treasures. And this hoard, you can also see on my background, is the Cordale hoard. It was found in Lancashire in northwest England in 1840. So why am I showing you something found in England when I'm talking about Ireland? The reason is that a Cordale is on the route from Dublin to York, which was the other main center of power for the Dublin Vikings. So this would have been the axis along which people in that polity would have traveled. So not a surprising fact to find the hoard there with items from Ireland. Okay. The date, 905, when the hoard was probably deposited, was decided on by scholars based on coins, datable coins that were found in the hoard. And the coins come from all over. The coins come from the Viking kingdoms of Eastern England, also from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the Southwest, but they also included Byzantine coins, Scandinavian coins, papal coins, coined by the ruling popes, North Italian coins, Frankish coins, and Islamic coins. And I'll talk a lot more about the Islamic world a little bit later. The year 905 falls shortly after the Vikings were temporarily expelled from Dublin. And so probably the context for the burying of this hoard is people leaving Viking Dublin, seeking shelter in York, and burying the hoard along the way. So here we have a case, as I mentioned earlier, where you have archaeological evidence that can confirm something in the written evidence. So the annals tell us about what happened. The Dublin Vikings were expelled from Dublin, and then in the ground you find this hoard, and that really does help to confirm the story. Looking at the hoard, we also get a sense of what was at stake economically in the control of Dublin, because it's clearly an economic hub of the Viking world with trading connections to every part of the Scandinavian trading network. So you have this one hoard, and it helps to illuminate the politics and the economy of Viking Dublin. Okay, so let's back up and get the Vikings to Ireland in the first place. So starting in the late 8th century, Scandinavians start taking to the seas. This is due probably to changes of some kind, economic changes, environmental changes, political changes within Scandinavian society. This is very difficult to pin down because we have really no sources for this period at all. But it could also have something to do with the fact that their ships were getting better and better. They could actually go farther. Here you have some depictions of Viking ships. The most striking thing about them is, of course, those fabulous figureheads carved to look like wondrous beasts. And these figureheads were famously, they were detachable. And you would take them off when you were heading into port because you didn't want to scare the genius of your own city. They were to scare your opponents. These were fabulously maneuverable ships because they could use sails and oars. So depending on the conditions of the wind, you could still make progress. They had the classic shallow draft that probably a lot of us know about that allowed them to maneuver up river systems. This was really one of the keys to Viking success because Europe and the islands of Ireland and Britain are full of rivers that you can navigate up pretty far with a shallow draft boat. And so anything along those rivers is reachable and is a fair game. Now, here is a replica of a Viking ship that was actually built in Dublin. So this is built in Dublin in 1042, and at some point it was sailed to Denmark, where it sank in the Roskilde Fjord. And it was found there in 1962. So again, under the water. This is archaeology from under the water. And the ship was reconstructed. In 2007, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde built this replica and sailed it back to Ireland, which I think is pretty cool. So you might ask, how do we know that the ship was built in Dublin in 1042? That seems oddly specific. Good question. The archaeologists analyzed the timbers in the ship, and they were well enough preserved that they could do this. And they determined that the timbers came from oak trees that were cut down in County Wicklow, just south of Dublin, in 1042. They used tree rings to actually match up the timbers, and that's how they could date them. So it's just amazing what we can figure out about archaeology. Now, by this point, you've probably heard me say, or other people say enough times, that the term Viking is a little bit of a modern thing. It was a medieval word, but it was usually not used as an ethnic designation. It was really more of a term for the activity that some people from Scandinavia engaged in, which was sort of entrepreneurial raiding and trading. The sources usually call them the Northmen, or the Norse, or the Danes, or just simply the foreigners. And I think that tells you something about how important they were, because they were the only kind of foreigners that it was worth talking about. Okay? Now, I've now done my duty pointing out that they're not really called the Vikings in this period, but we're going to call them the Vikings from now on without a trace of guilt. But I have some breaking news to insert into this recap. When I last presented to you, I said that raids began in Ireland in the late 8th century, beginning in 789 in the north, and then 793 in Lindisfarne. 795 is the first raid in Ireland. That was the chronology that I was always taught. But some skeletons have been found in Dublin that have been radiocarbon dated to sometime before 782. Which means that there may have been raids occurring before the earliest ones that got noticed in the annals. So something sort of slipped below the written radar, so to speak. So this activity might have been going on even for a few decades before we used to think. At any rate, from around that period on, the Vikings visited Ireland in small groups that grew larger and more organized over time. Perhaps based on news that filtered back to Scandinavia from the compatriots of the men who were buried in the Dublin area, the ones who didn't end up buried there. In 795, as I said, a group of Norse Vikings raided the island of Lambay off what is now County Dublin. And from then on, Vikings raided both in Ireland and all around the Irish Sea. They were mostly looking for movable wealth, and that could often be found in monasteries. For example, around the year 800, the great monastery of Iona was raided 3 times in a single decade. And I think it's a sign of the reputation that Iona had, that people thought it was worth going back time after time to sack it again. And this had just a huge impact on Irish cultural history, because one of the items that they didn't manage to get is this. This is the Book of Kells, which was probably moved to the mainland of Ireland for safekeeping, to keep it out of the hands of the Vikings. This is probably the single most important medieval object to survive in Ireland. And the reason it's Irish rather than Scottish is because of the Vikings. So if the Irish are keeping their valuables in monasteries, that's not an option that the Vikings have open to them. They can't exactly knock on the door and ask to make a deposit. So they are stowing their valuables, as I mentioned, underground. That is how we get to the Coordale hoard. There are lots and lots of these hoards. This map shows you all of the places where Viking hoards have been found in Ireland. And this fact causes hope to spring eternal in the heart of the metal detector enthusiast. So there's probably still more to find. The early phase of these lightning raids only lasted a couple of decades, and then we start seeing more organized raids with larger groups of ships, and they begin to move inland, and they stay for longer and longer periods. And they're operating, as you can see on the map on the right, the shaded area on the east coast, They're operating in the territory of the most powerful dynasty in Ireland, the Southern Uí I'll talk more about them in a moment. And in fact, they've fought some big pitched battles against the Uí which the Uí sometimes won. We should not think that the Vikings were 10 feet tall. They actually could be defeated and often were. But the character of the Viking presence in Ireland had changed in another very important respect. They're no longer merely raiding, they're actually settling down. They're building more permanent settlements, mostly along the coast. And the Irish called these the long fort or the ship harbors. And the word for ship is just long, and the word fort, that comes from the Irish word port, which is borrowed from Latin, and it's our same word port that we have in English. In 840 to 841, the Viking fleet wintered at Lough Neagh in the north of Ireland. And the next winter, they actually defended their long forts, their ship harbors, against Irish attacks at Lough Neagh and at Dublin. So this is where we really begin to see Viking Dublin coming in. And you can tell that, the Irish knew something was going on because they thought it was a good idea to attack these forts. On the slide on the right, you can see the excavation of one of these early long forts. The one you see on the slide is from north of Dublin in County Louth. All of the red dots on the map on the left are sites of Viking encampments from this early period, 840 or so. We do know that the same thing happened in Britain at around this time. So something is going on in the wider Viking world that's making them decide that putting down roots in Ireland and Britain is a good idea. And as I will mention a little bit later in the talk, we now know for sure that these settlers were coming from Norway, as opposed to other parts of the Scandinavian world. So now that we have gotten the Vikings to Ireland, they've begun to settle, let's move on to the initial Viking settlement at Dublin. On the slide, you see a mural by the Irish painter James Ward that was done in the early 20th century, and it hangs in the Dublin City Hall. It provides a dramatic and totally imaginary reconstruction of what the initial arrival of the Vikings in Dublin might have looked like. You can see the Irish on the shore looking at the Vikings, and they're obviously thinking, oh my, this is very bad news for us. And the presence of the monks in prayer is designed to emphasize for the viewer the confrontation between the Christian Irish and the pagan Norse. It may have looked like this, but we just don't know. But we can reconstruct what Dublin probably looked like when the Vikings arrived, at least in outline. It wasn't completely uninhabited. It was sparsely populated, as all Irish settlements were, outside of the really big monastic settlements. So early medieval Irish Dublin was situated in two locations on the south bank of the River Liffey, which I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. To the west was the ford of the Hurdles, or Acclaimed. So that's the ford of the Hurdles. You can see that right there on the slide. And to the east was the Black Pool, or Dove Lynn, that's Black Pool, where the small river Poddle flows into the larger river Liffey. Now these two settlement names, Acclaimed and Dove Lynn, have given us two settlement names. So there's the Black, I just want to mention quickly that this is the Black Pool. The Black Pool today is actually under the grounds of Dublin Castle. So there are two modern names for Dublin. One in English, derived from Dove Lynn, the Black Pool, that's Dublin. And one in Irish, Ballaclia, or the town of the ford of Hurdles. And incidentally, you do have to appreciate the humor involved in the sign. Okay, on the bottom of the slide, that's an actual sign that somebody erected in Ireland. The Irish do like to mess around with street signs. a very recent example of this that I didn't put in the presentation. There's a huge sports competition in Ireland every year. And the two main rivals in this competition are Dublin and Mayo. Mayo is a county in the west of Ireland. And so somebody put up a sign in Mayo pointing towards Dublin, and it gave the number of kilometers to the trophy that they are supposedly going to win in this competition. Sadly, Mayo lost. Mayo is my team. That was very sad. So around 841, the Vikings founded a long fort, okay, one of these ship harbors at Dublin, and that became the basis for the settlement that dominated the surrounding area for the next 6 decades. Now, the image that I've shown you on the slide is a little bit gruesome, but that is because a lot of our evidence for this early phase of settlement, in addition to what we find in the annals, comes from Viking graves that have been found in the Kilmainham Island Bridge area of Western Dublin. Many weapons have been found in the graves, like what you see on the slide, the sword there in this burial. And these weapons have been analyzed, and they were almost all of Norwegian manufacture. And this would suggest that the people buried here were either settlers who had arrived fairly recently, bringing their weapons with them, or that they were in close enough contact with their homeland to obtain weapons on a continuing basis. Okay? But there's also evidence in these graves that these men were merchants and craftsmen, as well as warriors. Everybody's doing more than one job. Archaeologists have also found scales and weights that would be used in the marketplace to check the value of goods, as well as tongs, purses, and hammers. So this was an economically diverse settlement that slotted itself into far-flung trade networks in the Scandinavian world right from the start. So who was in charge of this settlement? I'm relieved to know that some of you are genealogy fans, because a lot of times my students' eyes glaze over when I put a genealogy on the screen, and I have to apologize. The annals and the later Scandinavian sagas give us some tantalizing clues, enough to reconstruct a skeletal genealogy for the so-called kings of Dublin. Keeping in mind that these leaders were not formally crowned in the sense that we would see in the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe at the time. They were just the war leaders whom everyone basically acknowledged to be the top dogs at any given time. And they were often successful at passing this status along to their close relatives. In Dublin, you see a trio of brothers who were the sons of an important Norse leader in northern Britain named Geoffrey. And they were Avlev, Ivar, and Osla. The descendants of the middle brother, Ivar, would rule large segments of the Irish Sea world for the next few centuries, even after they were driven out of Dublin. These people were key figures in the wider Scandinavian world, and Dublin was their main power base. And that gives you a sign of how important Dublin was to the Vikings. Incidentally, the name Avlev gives us the very common modern Scandinavian name Olaf. So Avlev was an Irish translation of the medieval name Olaf. And now, of course, it's a name you will encounter all over the place. So Avlev fought a series of battles with the kings of the southern Uineal, or O'Neill family. And this was the most important dynasty in the Dublin area, as you can see on the map. And the struggle seems to have been rather evenly balanced. And in order to help in this struggle, Avlev allied himself with some of the enemies of the Uineal to the south in Leinster. So he slotted himself into an existing Irish rivalry. To these other Irish rulers in Leinster, the enemy of my enemy was my friend, even if he was a Viking. So right from the get-go, the Vikings in Ireland, in Dublin in particular, were becoming political players on the Irish scene. Avlev was succeeded by his brother Ivar, who bears the intriguing and inexplicable nickname of the Boneless. There are various theories about this nickname. If you want to know some of them, I will have to chat you privately because they're too embarrassing to say out loud. He could have just as easily been called Ivar the Bloodthirsty, as you can see from this rather gory photo from the rather over-the-top TV series, The Vikings. He was called by the Irish annals King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. And while this is certainly an exaggeration, it does capture a central truth, which is that the reach of the Dublin kingdom extended to the Isle of Man in the middle of the Irish Sea and to large parts of Western Scotland. This was definitely a maritime kingdom, remembering the fact that in this period, travel by sea was often quicker and safer than travel by land. I decided that if I had a choice here, I was going to cover the bloodthirsty part of Ivar. But around 902, the sons of Ivar underwent a setback. The native Irish rulers from the south in Leinster and from the west in Briga teamed up. They converged on Dublin and drove the rulers from the settlement. And there was a period of about 15 years when Dublin was ruled by the Irish. Incidentally, the Norse settlers in Dublin carried on under Irish rule. There was no indication that they departed en masse with their Norse rulers. So basically it was just different guys at the top. Okay? At this point, the Irish leaders found the settlement to be very valuable economically. Doubtless they were levying tribute from the Norse inhabitants. But this period of native Irish rule over Dublin proved to be extremely brief. So we will move on to our next topic, the resettlement of Viking Dublin. Because by 917, the dynasty of Ivar was back in Dublin and bigger and better than ever. A new settlement was built by Sitric, son of Ivar, and by the mid-10th century, the Norse were once again a strong presence, not just in Dublin, but in all of the coastal towns of Ireland, which they had founded. We know a lot more about this second phase of settlement in Dublin. We can tell, for example, that the layout was designed to take advantage of the physical contours of the site. And this is the first time that archaeologists who work on medieval town settlement patterns can identify this having been done deliberately. So it's kind of a big deal. In town planning terms, Dublin is very important. And the ties to Northern Britain only grew stronger. In fact, it was from Northern Britain that Sitric had been able to stage his comeback in Dublin. So whenever they were threatened in Ireland, they relied on their resources in Britain. When they were threatened in Britain, they relied on their resources in Ireland. So the two poles of the Dublin Kingdom of Dublin and York, which we probably could call it, in fact, those twin poles were actually extremely important to the success of this enterprise. And the kings of Dublin had big ambitions within the British Isles. One of their top priorities was to counter the threat of the expanding English kingdom under King Athelstan, the grandson of Alfred the Great. Athelstan was rolling back a lot of Viking gains, and in the process, he was creating a united English kingdom that had never existed before. So a number of other rulers on the island of Britain did not like this. They were worried about the rise of hegemony under England. And these discontented British rulers included the King of Scotland, Constantine. So they're getting nervous. And so they ally with each other to try to attack the King of England before he can get too powerful. And so our man from Ireland is brought into this struggle. And the result is the famous Battle of Brunanburh in 937. The key player in this from the Irish side is Olaf MacGoffrey, or in Norse, Olaf Gottfridsson, great-grandson of Ivar, who ruled Dublin from 934 to 941. So the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. We don't know exactly where it took place. This map shows you a couple of different theories about this. But we do know that the English won the battle decisively. And the rest, as we say, is history. England's march toward hegemony over the island of Britain was not interrupted. It wasn't complete. There is still a Scotland. But still, it's a measure of the importance of the Kingdom of Dublin that Olaf was involved in this alliance. His interests lay as much on the island of Britain as they did in Ireland. For him, it was an existential question whether the English were going to get too big for their britches, because he wanted to protect the York end of the Dublin-York pole. But the kings of Dublin were very attuned to local Irish politics as well. And they were not averse to making marriage alliances with the Irish rulers. For example, a mid-10th century king of Dublin and York named Olaf MacSitric, or Olaf Sigtryggsson, depending on how you want to spell it, married two different Irish princesses. And another important Dubliner, Ivan Bjarnason, married Rafferty, daughter of Kervil MacDougall, king of Ossory. And these are just two high-profile examples. Such marriages were taking place at all social levels. And this is probably partly how the Dublin Norse were Christianized via these marriages to the Christian Irish. Now, having made this point that the kings of Dublin are very well connected, both within Ireland and on the island of Britain, I am going to spare you any more 10th century politics and move on to the part of the talk with the pictures. This reconstruction gives at least a flavor of what life would have looked like in Dublin in the 10th century. And this is what Dublin probably looked like in about 1000. The buildings were made of wood and wattle, and they included houses and workshops, sheds, latrines, and possibly even a ceremonial platform. And you can see that there are actually timber roads throughout the settlement. They were probably not that comfortable to travel on, but they were there. Now, why do you bother to put a bunch of logs down? If you've ever spent any time in Ireland, you know that something wet comes out of the sky pretty much every day. And I actually lived there for 3.5 months one time. It literally rained for at least a part of every day that I was there. So this kind of walkway that you see in this scale model reconstruction would have been enormously helpful in counteracting the tendency of the roads to become muddy quagmires. You can also see at the bottom of the slide, very rudimentary stairways leading up from the river where the boats would moor alongside. So this is definitely a maritime city. Now we can make this reconstruction because of excavations that were done in the 1970s that helped archaeologists to determine the outline of the settlement and the kinds of materials that were used to build it. Now, I just find this picture amazing. They're actually able to find the medieval Viking city. Here is another view that shows you one of the larger Viking dwellings. And it just gives me goosebumps to look at this and think that real people actually lived in this house, of which only the outlines remain. Excavations of the Viking settlement in Dublin have been extensive. The interesting point being that some people initially objected to spending taxpayer money on this. Some people didn't want to dig up the Vikings because they had gotten a very bad press over time, but they finally relented, and the result is just some fabulous artifacts, and you can just see a couple of them on the slide. Now, of course, Dubliners are very excited about their Viking heritage. At Christchurch Place in Dublin, you can see this evocation of the artifacts found underneath, and they've been set into the paving stones of the street. I think this is really just a fabulously fun evocation of the archaeological riches of Viking Dublin. Some of the objects found are very quotidian, like these bone and antler combs, but still you can see that quite a lot of care was taken to adorn them. Okay. But some, of course, confirm the reputation of the Vikings as warriors. You can see these Viking swords in the Viking section of the National Museum of Archaeology in Dublin, which is by far my favorite place in the whole city. I always go there when I am in Dublin. I hang out at the Archaeological Museum and geek out. Okay. So what was life like in Dublin? By medieval standards, it was a large town. It probably had thousands of inhabitants. It would have been in the basic ballpark of a place like Dublin, like London or Paris. Really, so it was a really substantial settlement. Okay? And on the map, you can see a couple of ways of depicting the sphere of influence that the city would have exerted, the kind of hinterland argument about medieval cities. The left-hand one is kind of a minimalist version. The right-hand one is more of a maximalist version. But you can see there basically that the influence of the Vikings is mostly around those coastal settlements. Doesn't extend too far inland, although Dublin is the most extensive because it is the largest. Okay. The reason that this hinterland is so extensive is because the agricultural production of the region around Dublin was actually impacted by the presence of the city. People reorganized their agricultural way of life in order to supply the needs of the city. 4,000 people living in Dublin need a lot of food. And one of the things that they need is meat. So in order to feed that many people, you would have had to bring a lot of cows into Dublin. So those cattle are being raised in the area right around Dublin and being brought in to feed those inhabitants. Now, the Vikings who lived there could have raided for them, okay, but they also probably traded for them as well. Okay? And they definitely had an enormous impact on the local economy. The reason they need to bring cattle in is because they are not really farming themselves. They're doing other stuff. Obviously, trade is the most important thing that they're doing. Dublin is in a very good position along the major Viking trade routes that go all around the British Isles and out to Iceland, but also farther east and south. The Vikings brought a huge infusion of cash in the form of silver, much of which had been earned in plunder, but also in trade, okay? Much of it from the Islamic world. And you can see here some decorated lead weights that were used to make all the deals that came about as a result of this trade. As I mentioned earlier, you would need to check the weight of some of those artifacts if you were going to hack them up. Okay? How you can afford all the cows. We know about the trade because Islamic silver dirhams have been found all over the Viking world, many of which passed through Dublin. What you see on the slide is the Store Rock hoard from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And a lot of these coins probably passed through Dublin because this was a remote location. This is not where the trading was happening. This is probably where people were when something bad went down and they needed to bury their hoard. Okay. We have other Islamic artifacts as well. For example, this ring, which has an Arabic inscription on it. Some of the artifacts found included silk fibers. At that point, silk fibers could have only come from the East, since the secret of silk manufacture was not known in the West. So this could have been Islamic, it could have been Byzantine. Okay? In both areas, you would have been able to find silk manufacture. Dublin was a stopping off point for the wine, the wool, and the silver that went north, and it was exchanged for fur, amber, and the most important commodity going south from the Scandinavian world, slaves. Okay. And this is the most disturbing part of the story. We might be overselling the amount of plundering of goods that the Vikings did, but we're probably underselling the degree to which they were engaged in the slave trade, because it was probably the most important and valuable commodity that they were involved in trading. The most movable form of wealth in this period is actually people. This terrifying image on the slide is from an exhibit at the museum in Dublin. It's a slave chain and collar. Now, it must be said that the skull on display here was not, in fact, found with the chain and collar. So this is a little bit of over-egging the pudding, as the old expression goes. And I think the reason they chose it is because of the terrible wound to the cranium, sort of the idea that this was someone who died violently in captivity. Possibly, but not necessarily. Still, the artifact by itself, the chain and the collar, that's by itself enough. It's pretty horrifying. Slaves seized in Ireland could be traded locally, brought back to Scandinavia, or indeed traded as far away as the Islamic world. I did find a modern artist's rendering of the slave trade with the Islamic world, but it was too racist to show you. The issue of slavery brings me to one of the most interesting new kinds of evidence for studying the Vikings, and I sort of hinted at this at the very beginning, namely DNA. New research into Viking burials in Ireland has come up with some really interesting findings. The first is something that I've already mentioned, the confirmation that most Vikings in Ireland were from Norway, okay, as opposed to the Vikings who settled in Eastern England, who were largely from Denmark. So I am giving this talk to the right Scandinavian group. The other finding was that a lot of the Vikings who we find buried in Ireland had a significant amount of non-Scandinavian DNA, including Irish DNA. And it is thought that the Irish might have been reaching Scandinavia as part of the slave trade for a long time, and that that's where the DNA from Ireland came into the Scandinavian gene pool. Now, of course, once the Norse settled in Ireland, there was intermarriage, and many Irish people now have lots of Scandinavian DNA. Most of us, if we go to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, end up with some very interesting stories to tell about our ancestry. And incidentally, there is no particular reason why I put the Balandary sword on this map. Slide. It has nothing to do with DNA. I just like it. So let's get back to talking about material culture. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, and as everyone who has ever heard of the Vikings surely knows, they were famous for their ships, and Dublin was a center of shipbuilding. This was a great boon to the Irish economy, since before the Vikings arrived, most Irish boats looked like what you see on this slide. They were simply skin-covered coracles. The kind of boat that is represented by the sea stallion represented quite an improvement. This model of a Viking ship has stood outside the Dublin City Council office since 1997. And apparently people like to sit in it for an impromptu al fresco meal or snack. Just one quick additional artifact to show you to demonstrate that Vikings were not all business, violent or not. This is a wooden gaming board found to the west of Dublin in County Westmeath. It came with wooden pegs that would be moved around in the various holes. And so Vikings relaxed with a little game of Hnefatafl when they were tired of trading and raiding. And in fact, you can look up the rules of Hnefatafl and you can play it. Okay. Notice that the location of the find in a little bit to the west of Dublin could even indicate that this very Scandinavian game is being played by Irish people, because it comes from an area where probably the people living there were actually Irish, not Norse. And this is an indication that the Vikings were becoming, in a certain sense, just another part of the Irish scene. As the Vikings were increasingly converting to Christianity through the intermarriage and the trading contacts that I've already talked about, the Irish kings feel more and more comfortable working with them and accepting them as clients, as allies. Before long, Viking settlements have effectively been slotted into the native Irish political hierarchy of a few large dynasties competing for the allegiance of small client kingdoms. The Vikings were actually really great allies to have. They weren't really necessarily enemies to get rid of. course, they come with tremendous resources. They have friends they can invite and that sort of thing. And that brings me to the next to last topic I'm going to talk about, the famous Battle of Clontarf. This is another mural from the same series that I showed you earlier of historical images in Dublin City Hall. And you can see the main player in the Battle of Clontarf on the slide on the right with the crown. This is King Brian Boru, the Irish ruler who was the most successful ever in making the presence of the Vikings work to his advantage. Brian Boru was a Southern Irish king who allied with Vikings to help defeat his Irish rivals. Basically, they helped him climb the greasy pole of complicated Irish politics. At the Great Battle of Clontarf in 1014, just north of the Viking city of Dublin, Brian and his Viking allies defeated another Irish king and his Viking allies. This battle was later rebranded as a clash between the Irish and the Vikings, and the interpretation was formed that prevailed until very recent times that Brian drove the Vikings out of Ireland. And here is another place where I have an update to offer since I last spoke to you on this topic. Back then, I noted that I had learned the story of Brian Boru, the anti-Viking hero, as a very young student from some rather unsophisticated books of Irish history for children. But the story was spun this way a century after the battle by Brian's descendants, the O'Briens, in order to make their family look more impressive. So then we get a new version of the story. Some smart historians come along and say, wait a second, the Vikings and the Irish are actually coexisting in a kind of fruitful interchange, surely not without tension, but not without advantages to either side. That's the version I told you about last time, the version that downplayed the Irish versus Vikings element of the Battle of Clontarf. But after I gave that talk, I read a fairly new book about the subject by my favorite Irish medieval historian, Sean Duffy, and he has shed new light on the battle. So I'll remind you of what I said last time, then bring you up to speed. Up until the late 10th century, Ireland had enjoyed a more or less stable system. I really do mean more or less, where both the northern half of Ireland and the southern half of Ireland were each dominated by a single major dynasty. In the early 10th century, this system began to break down. And one of the results was the rise of a new dynasty in the south, in the southwest, that would end up replacing the dominant power there. And it was led by Brian Boru. He is obviously one of the most famous figures in Irish history. He was called the Lion of Ireland. Okay? There is a fabulous historical novel about him that I highly recommend. It's quite enjoyable. Well, it's a little bit of a potboiler, but it is super fun. Brian established his headquarters, as you can see on the slide, in the south, at Kincora in County Tipperary, or actually known in County Clare. But Brian is not content with merely being a provincial king. He aspired to more. And you can see, if you look on the map on the right, these are all the campaigns that Brian engaged in. He just went every place. The energy required to do this must have been enormous. But this is what you needed to do if you were an Irish ruler, because unless you showed up in person, nobody was going to do anything that you said. Okay? So Brian was able to take advantage of divisions within the other Irish kingdoms, and he was very adept at using the Norse settlements. He forged very helpful alliances with the Norse of Limerick, which was not far from his base at Kincora, as well as at Waterford and Cork, and even occasionally with Dublin. And his Norse allies often held the balance of power in his favor. Okay? He was also very good at PR, okay? So he was good at bringing the church in on his side, that sort of thing. But in the year 1012, the cracks started to show. Okay? Some northern leaders started to take the field against him, and Brian was forced to blockade Dublin in support of one of his other allies. So this brings Brian directly into confrontation with the Dublin Norse for the first time. not the first time, but actually he's done it a couple of times, but now we go at last to a really big confrontation. So this siege lasted over the winter. The Norse in Dublin knew that in the spring, the attack would be renewed. So they called in their allies from the Isles. So this is where that connection between the Dublin Kingdom and the rest of the Scandinavian world is super important. Okay? So Brian knows that these allies are on the way, these Scandinavian allies. And he's got another problem. The men of Leinster, who are in the area just south of Dublin, who have been chafing under Brian's overlordship for almost 2 decades, decide to move as well. So Brian calls in his supposed allies, but Brian's allies largely fail to turn out. To make matters worse, right before the battle, Brian falls out with one of his most important allies, the King of Meath. And basically he goes into battle with just the Limerick Norse on his side. So he's got very few Irish allies. He's just got his Viking allies, the Limerick Norse. And so we get the big confrontation between Brian and the men of Dublin and Leinster in 1014. The battle lasted all day. Eventually, Brian's side routed his opponents, the Leinstermen and the Dublin Norse, but Brian was killed in his tent by Norsemen who were retreating in panic. The King of Leinster was also killed, though the King of the Dublin Norse managed to preserve himself by staying out of the battle completely. After Brian died, he was taken north to Armagh and buried in the cathedral there with elaborate ceremonial. His resting place is still marked in Armagh Cathedral today. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of the battle is the fact that we have accounts of the battle from both the Irish perspective and the Viking perspective. And I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. And they distort events of the battle in interesting ways. The work that was commissioned by Brian's descendants, the O'Briens, the War of the Gael against the Foreigner, exaggerates the unity of the Irish on the one side and the Vikings on the other, and it casts Brian as a hero who always knew that he was going to drive the Vikings out. That was what he was doing from the very first day of his career. My mission is. Okay? So that's what you get in this text. There are obvious distortions in this account, such as the fact that even though Brian's army won the battle, after he was killed, his men had to retreat to the southwest, and the whole way they were harassed by other Irish people. So, oops, that is really not a sign that you have established hegemony over the country if you are actually being harassed by other Irish people all the way back to your base. It also glosses over the fact that there are Vikings on both sides of the battle. But that fact, that you've got Vikings on both sides, is interestingly one of the things that the Old Norse text gets right. Okay? And the reason is because it's all about the Norse. Okay? This is Njal's saga, as I mentioned before, that is really mostly about Iceland, but there's this really important digression that has to do with a big feud that took place between rulers in the Scandinavian world that spilled over into Ireland. Okay? Now, if in the pro-Brian text, the Irish text, you are forgiven if you don't realize that Vikings fought on both sides, in the saga, in Njal's saga, you could be forgiven for not realizing that the fighting had anything to do with the Irish, because it's really presented as an intra-Scandinavian feud. So how does my man, Professor Duffy, change things? He essentially argues that there is something to the old narrative after all. According to Duffy, Brian really did save Ireland from the Vikings, even if that wasn't what he'd started out to do from day one of his career. Okay? The reason is that this major invasion, the people were coming to help out the Dublin Norse, that was a super big deal. And the fact that that invasion was forestalled made the difference. Okay? Because Duffy has been able to reconstruct that this invasion was way more consequential than anybody used to think. Okay? It wasn't just a couple of guys being called in as backup. It was an attempt to really take over this area. And we should keep in mind that at the same time that the Battle of Clontarf was being fought, in England, at the time. The Danes were fighting tooth and nail to take over England, which they did. They seized England and ruled it for 50 years. So the idea that this invasion of Ireland might have been a little bit bigger of a deal than we thought in the past has some merit. Okay? There's still some historiographical controversy over this, but I'm fairly persuaded the Dublin Kingdom at this time was really making a grab for expanding its power, for continued relevance. It just didn't work out. And that brings me inevitably to my sixth and final and very brief topic, the decline of Viking Dublin. The battle itself did not end the Viking presence in Ireland. The Norse communities persisted for centuries thereafter, but they changed in character. They became more exclusively trading settlements. There was an end to active raiding. This probably has not as much to do with the actual Battle of Clontarf as with other factors, including the conversion of the Scandinavians back home to Christianity. After about 1000, a lot of times the Vikings are really not going a Viking anymore. They're not raiding as much. They are working on state building. Now, the end of the Viking story in Ireland is a little bit less glorious. For 2 centuries after the Battle of Clontarf, the Norse settlements maintained their distinctive identity. They're still speaking Norse there. They're still in economic touch with the Scandinavian world. And the city of Dublin was very important politically. But the Dublin Norse were less and less able to maintain their political independence, and they were more and more likely to fall under the overlordship of one or the other of the Irish provincial kings. So from the late 11th century on, the king of Dublin is usually, in fact, the Irish king of Leinster or one of the other Irish kings. The Dubliners are not ruling themselves anymore. And by this point, you actually start to get a change in terminology. The Dublin Norse are now referred to as the Ostmen, or men of the East. They still are ethnically distinct, but they're more and more really just ruled by the Irish. And so we come to our second invasion that really sort of puts paid to the distinctive character of the Dublin Norse completely. At the time that the English invade in the 1160s or 70s, this is what Ireland would have looked like with still these Viking enclaves on the coast. But when the English come around, they seize control of the Viking towns. The reason is because that's where the money is, right? I mean, that's where the economic power of the country resides. And so those are the areas that the English feel the most desire to control. So once they seize the towns, they start bringing in settlers, they start changing all sorts of aspects of the administration of the cities, and the Norse language dies out. Okay? And instead, you have languages that are spoken by the English settlers, which are in some cases not English, but French. But the Vikings in Dublin are alive and well in a rather cheesy and touristy fashion. In Dublin, you can take a tour on an amphibious vehicle called Viking Splash. I've actually seen them. They do hand out these Viking plastic helmets, which is a look that some of us can pull off, and I would say some of us can't. When you're next in Dublin, you can decide whether to get your Viking on. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sure we have questions for Dr. Paxton.
I'd be interested in any kind of books relating to hoards or archaeological finds as a blacksmith and metalworker.
Oh, wow, that's fabulous.
Kind of fun to recreate not giant things like swords, but things that are a little more modest in size.
Well, I'm not going to be able to help you out in the technical details of that, but you can probably find references in this book, which I'm not sure if you'll be able to see on the slide.
Okay.
The Vikings in Ireland It was published by the Viking Ship Museum. I'll put that in the chat. There are some good references there.
And the other thing, you mentioned some early in the talk, some skeletons in Dublin, and I have compared, was that the published series of 422 quote unquote Viking skeletons that you're referring to?
I'm not sure which series it is. I'd have to look that up. But there have been several different batches of skeletons. The ones I was talking about are the ones that are from the 9th century, as opposed to the 10th century settlement.
There was one set published that were 422, and they weren't specific to the geography. They were just supposedly Viking archaeological digs. And I compared my own Y DNA to that list and came up with a hit in Dublin. And it was the middle. I had 3 hits. One was the youngest was in Oxford, England. And then I estimated 300 years older was in Dublin.
Wow.
And then quite a long ways back was in Russia after that.
That's really interesting. And it gives you a sense of how much the Vikings got around.
Exactly.
And there was there's actually a very interesting find of skeletons in Oxford you may know about from the early 11th century. These are a group of skeletons that people died violently, and they think that they can tie it to a specific event. It was called St. Brice's Day Massacre, when Danes throughout England were massacred on the orders of the king in revenge for various wrongs. And the king later, we know about this because the king later had to pay reparations to the church where those Vikings had taken refuge, because a mob burst in and killed them and damaged the church. So, I mean, these were tough times, very, very difficult times. I do see it's a couple things in the chat that I wanted to respond to. Lots of redheads near York in modern times. Yes, there's a lot of red hair in this whole part of the world. The largest concentration of red hair is Scotland, interestingly, and certainly lots and lots of Viking influence in Scotland, particularly in the north and west. And I love the comment about the WPA murals, because yes, murals, I love murals, by the way. Historical murals are absolutely one of my favorite things. You can definitely tell a lot about how a society is trying to depict its past and what they think is important, and how that changes. Any of you who are local, there are some fabulous murals in the Capitol that are really fun to look at. Any other questions?
What DNA has been revolutionized our understanding of a lot of what happens. What other technologies do you see are going to also affect our understanding of the past?
Well, there's a lot going on now in environmental history that I think is going to really revolutionize our understanding of the past. This is not stuff that I work on myself, but I do have colleagues who do. So a lot of work is being done with ice cores and pollen, and I mentioned the tree rings, all kinds of studies that are able to give very precise ideas of the climate at particular times. And that is really helping us to understand some of these movements of peoples in some cases, because if you can actually identify periods when there was a big shift in climate, that could certainly have provoked particular movements of peoples.
And you mentioned the book Vikings in Ireland. Is that something you would recommend for following up on some of the topics, or is there other books you'd also recommend?
this is a great book because it gives you a really good overview of a number of different topics, and it's written by specialists in each of the fields. So it's got chapters on Viking towns. There's one on hoards. There's one on graves and grave goods, Irish and Scandinavian art, and lots of really good references. So it's a fabulous resource. And I like the shout out for the National Museum in Dublin. Yeah, it's that section is fantastic, and their website's excellent as well. So if you are not planning a visit to Dublin in the near future, but you want to learn more about this stuff, their website has lots and lots of resources. Any other questions? Well, it's really been delightful. I really enjoyed the chance to talk about Viking Dublin with all of you. And I am so thrilled that your group is doing so well and that you've weathered the storm. And I wish you all the best as you return slowly but surely to in-person events.
Well, thank you very much for the talk, and we appreciate it. As I think we all found it very interesting and enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And